The Appalachian Mountains, with their mist-shrouded peaks and endless valleys, have long been a cradle for stories whispered by firelight and etched into local memory. Here, among ridges that swallow sunlight before the evening bell and hollows so deep they seem untouched by time, entire generations lived and died with little intrusion from the outside world. It is within this wilderness, isolated yet strangely binding, that one of Appalachia's darkest legends took root, a tale so haunting that it survives today in fragments, half-truths and warnings to children who wander too close to forgotten cabins. The story begins in the early 1900s in a pocket of southern West Virginia, where families bore the burden of both poverty and secrecy. These were not communities bound by bustling town squares or new roads. Instead, they were tied by blood sometimes too closely. Marriage often meant convenience or survival rather than choice, and kinship circles grew tight, strangling rather than strengthening. At the center of the tale was the Harper family. Their cabin, a sagging structure of hand-hewn logs, clung to the side of a ridge above a creek that locals still call Widow's Branch. For decades, the Harpers lived in near total isolation. They planted corn, raised hogs, and kept to themselves. Outsiders seldom came knocking, and the Harpers seldom left the shadow of their mountain. Elias Harper, the patriarch, was described as a tall, gaunt man with coal-black hair and a temper that frightened even the bravest neighbors. Widowed in his 40s after his wife succumbed to pneumonia one bitter winter, Elias raised his only daughter, Clara, alone. She was 6 years old at the time, small and delicate, with eyes so pale they seemed almost gray. Elias was a strange man, recalls Henry McGraw, now 97, one of the last living men who remembers the Harpers. Even before his wife passed, he kept to himself. Clara's mama used to run down to the store for flour or salt, and she always looked over her shoulder like something wasn't right at home. After she died, nobody saw Clara much at all. Just Elias, coming down the road once in a while with that stare of his. As Clara grew older, her isolation became more noticeable. Unlike other girls her age, she did not join church socials, did not laugh with cousins at corn shuckings, and did not visit the small schoolhouse by the creek. Neighbors whispered that Elias kept her close, too close, but no one dared confront him. In those mountains, privacy was both a shield and a prison. By the time Clara turned 18, the whispers had turned into certainty. Her slight frame, always hidden beneath patched dresses, began to swell with pregnancy. No suitor had ever been seen climbing the ridge to court her, no letters arrived, and no boy in town admitted to knowing her. Still, Elias appeared one spring morning at the general store, trading eggs for baby blankets. "My daughter's expecting," he muttered, his face as hard as the stones in the creek bed. The storekeeper, William Croft, remembered the moment vividly. There was no joy in his voice, none of the nervous pride you'd expect from a father-to-be. Just cold, cold as the mountain itself. I knew right then something was wrong, but in those days folks didn't meddle unless it spilled over into town. And with Elias, well, no one wanted to be on the wrong side of him. That summer, Clara gave birth to a boy. The midwife, Annie Lou Carter, was summoned at the last possible moment. She later told neighbors that the baby bore strange features, a flattened nose, misshapen fingers, and eyes that seemed to cross before focusing. "I'd seen babies born with deformities before," Annie Lou admitted years later, "but this one, it wasn't just nature playing tricks, it was blood. Blood too close to blood." The boy survived only a few weeks. No grave was ever marked, though locals whispered that a small mound of freshly turned earth appeared one morning behind the Harper cabin. Clara herself seemed to vanish from sight for months after. When she reappeared in town with her father the following spring, she kept her eyes down, her hands folded tightly against her chest, and her steps always a fraction behind his. The cycle did not end there. Over the next decade, Clara bore 3 more children. 2 were stillborn. One lived to see its 2nd year before succumbing to fever. Each time, Elias descended into town for supplies, blankets, sugar, medicine, while Clara remained a shadow at his side. Each time, the community's suspicions grew darker, yet silence held them fast. It was like watching a storm you knew was coming. But no one wanted to admit it, says Martha Jane Fletcher, who was a child during those years. People whispered. We all knew or thought we knew. But in those mountains, family was family, and what happened behind a cabin wall wasn't ours to touch. Still, I'll never forget the way Elias looked at Clara, not like a father. Not like he should? By the early 1940s, the Harper legend had already taken shape. The war was pulling young men from the mountains, and roads were finally carving paths into once isolated hollows. But Elias resisted change. He grew older, his hair grayer, yet his hold on Clara only seemed to tighten. When neighbors saw them, rare as that was, it appeared less like father and daughter and more like husband and wife. One story from that time has lingered in particular. During a summer revival at the local church, Elias arrived unexpectedly, dragging Clara behind him. She must have been nearly 30 by then, her face pale and hollow. When the preacher extended a hand to welcome them, Elias refused. He simply said, "She's mine," before leading her back down the dirt road. That chilled us to the bone, recalls Reverend Samuel Turner, whose father was the preacher that day. It wasn't the words so much as the way he said them. Like a man staking a claim. Folks in the pews sat there in silence, but every one of them knew what he meant. By the mid-1940s, Clara gave birth again. This time, the child, a girl named Lila, survived. Against all odds, Lila grew with fewer visible deformities than her siblings, though she was sickly and frail. Elias adored her with a possessive pride that unsettled everyone who saw them together. To him, she was not a granddaughter but something closer, though words failed to capture the wrongness of it. It was around this time that the story began to shift from whispered suspicion to folkloric dread. Travelers spoke of eerie cries echoing from the Harper Ridge at night, of a woman's voice singing lullabies in tones more mournful than sweet. Children were warned not to wander near Widow's Branch. And when locals saw Clara walking the narrow path into town, her daughter clutched to her chest. They claimed her face bore the haunted expression of someone trapped between Roll's child, mother, and wife all at once. She never looked up, recalls old Nellie Harper, a distant cousin. Just kept her eyes on the ground, like the earth might swallow her if she stopped walking. I think she wanted it to. By 1950, Elias was an old man, his body bent but his grip on Clara unbroken. When he died that winter, slumped in his chair by the fire, the community expected Clara to finally step into her own life. But instead, she withdrew even further. Neighbors said she rarely left the cabin, tending to Layla with a desperation that bordered on madness. And here the line between truth and legend blurs. Some say Clara continued the cycle with her own daughter. That isolation and despair twisted into something even darker. Others believe Lila fled the mountain as soon as she was able, never looking back. What remains certain is that by the mid-20th century, the Harper cabin stood abandoned. Its windows shattered, its timbers sagging, it became a place children dared each other to approach after dark. Local historian Gerald Whitlow sums it up best. The Harpers are gone now, but their story lingers. Some say it's just gossip grown into folklore. Others swear it's proof that the mountains keep their darkest secrets hidden until they seep into the land itself. Either way, people still whisper the same warning. Up on Widow's Branch, she was both daughter and wife. And that truth is heavier than the stones that mark their graves. By the time the 1950s settled into the hollows of southern West Virginia, the Harper cabin had become more than a dwelling. To neighbors, it was a shadow on the ridge, a constant reminder of the whispers that had haunted the community for decades. When Elias Harper died, townsfolk believed the darkness surrounding the family might finally lift. But for Clara, freedom was not deliverance, it was a new prison. Clara buried her father behind the cabin, near the unmarked mounds where her lost children already lay. She worked the soil with her bare hands, her daughter Lila beside her, only 7 years old. In silence, they placed stones over his grave. No preacher was called, no hymns were sung. The mountain itself became the witness, holding yet another secret in its rocky chest. People thought she'd come down after Elias died, recalls Doris Jenkins, who was a girl in those days. They thought she might finally join church again or bring Lila to school. But she didn't. If anything, she went deeper into the mountain. You'd see her once in a while with that little girl, walking stiff, eyes on the ground, same as always. Folks said Elias might have been gone, but he still had his hold on her. For Layla, Childhood was a strange mixture of silence and suffocation. Clara taught her to tend a garden, mend clothes, and sing old hymns in a soft, trembling voice. Yet neighbors noticed an unsettling closeness between mother and daughter, too much like the shadowed bond Clara once shared with her own father. Layla seldom spoke when others were around. When she did, her words were clipped, rehearsed, as if she feared saying the wrong thing. By the early 1960s, rumors of the Harpers reached beyond Widow's Branch. Travelers passing through the mountains told stories of a pale woman and her daughter haunting the ridge, their lantern light flickering between the trees. Hunters claimed to hear Clara's voice carried on the wind, singing lullabies not meant for human ears. Some believed the Harpers were cursed. Others whispered that Clara, shaped by Elias's corruption, had turned into something unholy herself. But the most disturbing claims came from those few who glimpsed Lila as she entered adolescence. "She looked too much like Elias," said Frank Howard, an old miner who once passed them on the trail. Not just in the eyes, though she had that same hard stare. It was the way Clara held her arm like she was clinging to a man, not a child. I never forgot that, never wanted to. The pattern, it seemed, was repeating. Isolated families often folded in on themselves, their bloodlines looping until deformity or madness consumed them. Local historian Rebecca Tinsley explains, in Appalachia, especially in the hollows cut off by geography, marrying kin wasn't uncommon. But there were Rule's cousins, maybe second cousins, sometimes uncles and nieces. Beyond that was a boundary rarely crossed. The Harpers stepped over it. And once that line was crossed, it blurred for generations. Clara gave birth again in 1962. Who the father was, no one dared ask aloud, though the implications burned hotter than any coal fire. The baby, a boy named Thomas, lived only a week. The midwife who had once delivered Clara's children refused to climb the ridge this time. Instead, the birth was whispered about afterward, with neighbors noting Clara's exhausted figure in town and the absence of any child in her arms. After Thomas, Clara bore no more children, but her daughter Lila was growing, her body maturing beneath the watchful eye of a mother who had never known a world outside Elias's twisted shadow. In time, the town's suspicion turned toward the girl. Would she, too, be trapped in the cycle? Would the Harper curse carry forward another generation? By the late 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War were changing the nation, but on Widow's Branch, time seemed frozen. Clara's hair had gone white, her back stooped from years of labor and grief. Layla, now in her late teens, was her mirror, pale, withdrawn, and bound to the cabin as if invisible chains tied her to its crumbling walls. She was beautiful in a strange way, remembers Clarence Miller, who was 17 when he first saw Lila at the general store. Not the kind of beauty you'd see in magazines, pale, thin, like something carved from the mountain itself. But there was sadness in her eyes, deep as a well. She didn't speak, not once. Just stood behind Clara, clutching a basket. When I tried to smile at her, she looked away so fast it was like she'd been burned. What happened next remains one of the murkiest chapters in the Harper legend. Some say Clara forced her daughter into the same role she had endured, blurring the lines of motherhood and possession. Others claim Layla resisted, but with no escape from the mountain, her resistance withered. Either way, by the early 1970s, Leela herself was pregnant. The news spread quietly through the valley. No man in town claimed her. No suitor had been seen. And just as Elias had once done, Clara appeared in the store one afternoon, her face expressionless, trading eggs for baby clothes. It was like watching the past repeat itself, said Mary Lou Sanders, who stood behind her in line that day. The same story, just a new face. Folks stopped even pretending not to know. We all knew, but what could anyone do? By then, the law didn't touch things that far up the ridge. In the summer of 1972, Leela gave birth to a daughter. The baby was frail but alive, her tiny cries echoing through the hollow. Neighbors claimed they heard the wail in the still of night, followed by Clara's trembling hymns. Layla, barely 20, was said to cling to the child with the same desperate love Clara once showed. But unlike Clara, she did not withdraw entirely. A handful of times she brought the baby into town, her eyes darting nervously as if searching for something she could not name. "She looked trapped," said Earl Whitlow, whose family ran the mill. Like she wanted someone to help her, but the words wouldn't come. I'll never forget the way she held that baby like she was shielding it from the world. Or maybe from her own mama. By then, the Harper cabin had become a place of fear. Children dared each other to creep close after sundown, swearing they saw figures moving in the windows. Adults avoided the ridge altogether. The legend was no longer just whispered, it was spoken outright, a cautionary tale of what isolation and sin could create. Then came the fire. One bitter night in 1974, a glow lit the ridge above Widow's Branch. Flames consumed the Harper cabin, devouring decades of silence and sorrow. Neighbors rushed toward the blaze, but by the time they arrived, the structure was nearly gone. Clara's body was found near the hearth, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Lila and the baby were gone. To this day, no one knows what became of them. Some say Lila perished in the fire, her remains lost in the ash. Others believe she fled into the night with her daughter, finally breaking free from the mountain's grip. I like to think she escaped, says Gerald Whitlow, the historian. That she walked down the ridge, baby in her arms, and kept walking until the mountains no longer held her. But legends don't end neatly, and the Harper story, well, it lingers. Folks still say that on cold nights you can hear Clara's lullabies drifting down Widow's Branch. Maybe it's the wind. Or maybe it's a reminder of what blood and silence can do. Even now, decades later, the Harper tale circulates in the Appalachian oral tradition. Families warn their children not to wander too far alone. Couples walking the ridge after dark claim to see a pale figure clutching a baby, her eyes gray as mountain fog. Some insist the Harper line lives on in nearby towns, hidden in plain sight, the truth buried beneath changed names and forgotten records. But in the heart of the legend lies one chilling refrain. She was both daughter and wife. And that phrase carries a weight that the mountains themselves seem unwilling to release. The Harper cabin may have burned to the ground in 1974, but its shadow never left the ridge. For the people of Widow's Branch, the flames did not end the story. They ignited it. Without walls or windows to contain its horrors, the tale of the Harpers spilled into the valley, blending with the older, darker veins of Appalachian folklore. By the late 1970s, stories of Clara and Layla were told in the same breath as tales of witches, haints, and lost souls that haunted the mountains. Some claim the fire had been no accident, that it was Clara herself who set the blaze, finally consumed by the same curse that had shaped her life. Others whispered it was Lila who struck the match, choosing destruction over another generation bound in silence. After that night, folks swore you could still see the glow of that fire on certain evenings, recalls George McNeil, who was a boy when the cabin burned. Like the ridge itself remembered. My daddy wouldn't let me go near Widow's Branch after dark. Said it was cursed ground. Said the Harpers weren't gone, they'd just changed. It didn't take long for sightings to begin. Hunters spoke of a pale woman drifting between the trees, a baby cradled in her arms. Children claimed to hear lullabies, soft but trembling, carried on the wind. And some families who lived close to the ridge swore that their livestock grew restless at night, staring toward the hollow as if something unseen watched from the shadows. Local historian Rebecca Tinsley notes, Appalachian communities have always blurred the line between history and haunting. When tragedy is too heavy to explain, it becomes folklore. The Harpers embodied every fear these mountains held: incest, secrecy, madness, and the suffocating weight of isolation. When the cabin was gone, the people needed a shape to hang those fears on. So Clara became a ghost and Lila became a mystery. The most enduring legend centers on Clara's voice. Throughout the 1980s, hikers and campers reported hearing a woman singing hymns on the ridge long after midnight. The songs, they said, were slow and mournful, laced with words half-remembered from church services, but bent into something uncanny. I heard it myself in 1983, says Geraldine Cole, who grew up in a nearby hollow. I was camping with friends and we thought someone left a radio on. But it wasn't a song you'd hear on the radio. It was a mother's song. Sweet, but so sad it made your skin crawl. We didn't last the night, packed up and left before sunup. The stories grew darker with each telling. Some swore the lullabies weren't meant for comfort but for binding, that Clara sang to keep her daughter tied to the ridge, even in death. Others believed it was Lila's voice, not Clara's, calling out for help she never received in life. By the early 1990s, Widow's Branch was a place of dares. Teenagers crept up the ridge with flashlights, daring each other to step onto the foundation stones where the cabin once stood. Some claimed to find dolls fashioned from corn husks scattered in the ash. Others described sudden chills, the sound of footsteps circling them, or the faint cry of a baby in the trees. It was a rite of passage, says Daniel Price, who grew up in McDowell County. If you wanted to prove you were brave, you went to Widow's Branch. But most of us never made it all the way to the ruins. The closer you got, the heavier the air felt, like you weren't supposed to be there, like something wanted you gone. One story from 1996 still circulates in local memory. A group of 4 teenagers hiked up to the ridge on Halloween night, carrying candles and a Ouija board. They set the board on the blackened stones and asked if anyone was there. The plan was to laugh, maybe scare each other. But the plan ended when the board spelled out a single word, mine. Those kids came tearing back into town. White as sheets, remembers Sheriff Robert Delaney, who took their statement. Said they saw a woman standing at the tree line holding something in her arms. Said her eyes shone gray in the candlelight. Now, whether that's truth or teenage imagination, I'll never know, but they never went back. None of them. By then, the Harper legend had seeped into the identity of the region. Local writers published pamphlets blending fact and folklore, weaving the Harpers into the same tapestry as the Bell Witch of Tennessee or the Brown Mountain Lights of North Carolina. Church elders used the story as a cautionary tale against sin and secrecy. Parents warned children that if they wandered too far, the Harper woman would take them, mistaking them for the baby she lost. But beneath the ghost stories lay a truth more unsettling. The Harpers were real. Their names appeared in census records, their land deeds filed in the county courthouse. Old birth certificates hinted at children who lived only days or weeks. And though the cabin was gone, its ashes still stained the ridge. It's that mix of fact and myth that makes it powerful, says folklorist Aaron Clevenger. If it were pure fiction, it wouldn't have lasted. But people can trace the Harpers in public records. They can visit the ridge. They can hear the old-timers talk about Clara and Elias. That's what makes the legend stick. It's built on bones. Throughout the 2000s, paranormal investigators began visiting Widow's Branch. Some carried infrared cameras, others voice recorders. A few claimed success. One team reported capturing a faint woman's voice on tape, repeating the phrase, "She's mine." Another showed footage of an orb of light drifting across the ruined hearthstones before vanishing into the woods. Skeptics dismissed it all, but for locals it only deepened the lore. Not all encounters were sought out. In 2011, a man hunting deer near the ridge returned shaken, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. His brother later admitted, he swore a woman walked past him, pale as snow, holding a baby. Didn't make a sound, didn't look at him, just walked through the brush like she wasn't even there. The legend also transformed into a kind of morality tale. In Appalachian storytelling circles, the Harpers became an example of what happens when isolation and secrecy take root. Children were warned that lies fester, that silence can become a curse. And threaded through it all was the refrain that gave the story its haunting title. She was both daughter and wife. By the 2010s, the Harper tale was no longer just whispered in McDowell County. It spread through online forums, YouTube videos, and podcasts about haunted Appalachia. Outsiders traveled miles to see the ridge for themselves, often leaving with nothing but mosquito bites and eerie silence. Yet some claimed more. A woman from Ohio reported hearing a lullaby in the woods, the words unintelligible but the tune unmistakably maternal. A group from Kentucky swore they found a child's shoe half buried in the earth, far too old and weathered to belong to anyone living. Still, for those who grew up in the shadow of Widow's Branch, the legend isn't entertainment, it is inheritance. It's not a ghost story for us, says local teacher Amanda Fields. It's family history. It's what happens when darkness is left to grow in silence. The Harpers aren't just ghosts, they're warnings. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the tale is its uncertainty. Did Lila truly escape the fire with her child? If so, where did she go? Did the Harper bloodline continue in secret, scattered among the towns that dot the Appalachian valleys? Some genealogists suggest it's possible, though no proof has surfaced. What is certain is that the mountain remembers. The ridge where the cabin stood still draws curious souls, still provokes uneasy glances from those who live nearby. On cold nights, when fog drapes the hollows and the wind whistles through bare trees, some swear they hear a hymn drifting down the slope. Others claim they've seen gray eyes watching from the timberline. And always, the story circles back to the same words: she was both daughter and wife. A phrase that is less a description than a curse, echoing through the mountains like a prayer twisted in the dark. The story of the Harpers should have ended with ashes on Widow's Branch, scattered in the wind and swallowed by the earth. But like the stubborn roots of mountain laurel, some tales refuse to die. They twist their way through stone and soil until they bloom again, generation after generation. In McDowell County, West Virginia, the Harper name is rarely spoken aloud. Families who once lived near the ridge won't claim any kinship, though court records and census rolls suggest otherwise. A handful of surnames appear again and again, their lines too tangled to easily unravel. There are people walking around today who carry Harper blood, says genealogist Ruth Ann Givens. They may not know it. They may not want to know it, but the ridge doesn't forget. For the rest of Appalachia, the Harpers have grown beyond history. They have become symbol, story, and specter all at once. Their tale is whispered in schoolyards, recited around campfires, and dissected in online forums where outsiders marvel at the strangeness of mountain life. To locals, though, it remains something heavier, an inherited wound, raw even after decades. Folks think it's just a ghost story, says Reverend Carl Meadows, who has preached in McDowell County since the 1970s. But it's more than that. It's about sin passed down like sickness. It's about what happens when families turn inward instead of outward. Clara and Lila are ghosts, yes, but they're also warnings. Warnings, it seems, that still carry weight. The haunting of Widow's Branch. To this day, visitors climb the slope to where the Harper cabin once stood. The path is overgrown, the stones blackened and half buried, but the site still pulls at the curious and the brave. Many leave offerings, flowers, coins, even dolls carved from wood or corn husks. Others leave nothing but footprints, eager to say they stood where legend and life collided. But some leave shaken. In 2017, a documentary crew traveled to McDowell County to film a special on Appalachian hauntings. They spent 3 nights on Widow's Branch, cameras pointed at the ruins. On the second night, one of their recorders picked up what sounded like a woman humming a hymn. No one in the crew had heard it in real time. It wasn't just background noise, said producer Mark Talbot. It was melody. A lullaby. When we played it back, the hair on my arm stood straight up. The footage never made it to television. Rumors claim the network deemed it too disturbing. But clips circulated online, fueling the legend for a new generation. Comments flooded in from viewers claiming they heard words hidden in the humming, a mother's voice saying, "She's mine." Locals shook their heads. For them, it wasn't entertainment. That ridge has been haunted since the day Clara drew her last breath, says longtime resident Edith Morgan. The dead don't rest easy when their lives were lived in chains. And Clara lived in chains of her own making. Folklore as inheritance and Appalachian tradition, stories serve as both memory and warning. They explain the unexplainable, and they keep children close to home when the woods grow dark. The Harper story fits neatly into that tradition, passed from porch to porch, generation to generation. Some tell it as a ghost story, the daughter who became a wife, cursed to walk the ridge forever with her dead child in her arms. Others frame it as a parable, proof that secrecy breeds sickness, that sin hidden too long poisons not only one family but an entire community. The Harpers are our cautionary tale, says folklorist Aaron Clevenger. They embody the dangers of isolation. In Appalachia, where valleys cut communities off from one another, people feared what could happen when families turned inward. The Harpers became the face of that fear. In some versions of the story, Clara is the villain, a mother who betrayed her role by blurring the lines between protection and possession. In others, she is the victim, a girl raised too close to the fire, repeating the sins forced upon her. And in nearly every telling, Layla becomes the tragic figure, the daughter who never had a choice, the wife who never wanted to be one. Modern echoes. While the Harper tale has deep roots, it has not remained confined to oral history. In recent years, it has inspired novels, stage plays, and even a low-budget horror film shot in neighboring Kentucky. Each retelling reshapes the legend, emphasizing different pieces of the puzzle: incest, madness, haunting, or maternal obsession. Yet all circle back to the same refrain: she was both daughter and wife. But in McDowell County, the story still stirs unease. In 2021, a group of paranormal enthusiasts held a public ghost hunt on Widow's Branch, charging admission to curious outsiders. Locals protested, calling it exploitation of pain that was too real to be commercialized. The event went forward, but storms forced the group off the ridge before midnight. Some called it coincidence. Others called it warning. "I don't think people understand what they're dealing with," says teacher Amanda Fields. "This isn't some campfire ghost made up for thrills. These were real people, real lives twisted by silence. When outsiders come here to gawk, they aren't just poking at a story, they're stirring a wound." Did the line continue? Perhaps the most chilling question of all is whether the Harper line truly ended with the fire. Some claim that Layla escaped with her child, vanishing into the valleys beyond. If true, that child would be in their 70s today, perhaps alive, perhaps with children and grandchildren of their own. Genealogist Ruthin Givens has spent years combing records, searching for traces. "There are gaps," she explains. "Births unaccounted for, names that vanish from census rolls. It's possible Lila changed her name or married quietly in another county. If her child lived, the bloodline continues. And if the bloodline continues, the curse continues." But others argue the opposite, that the legend itself is the curse. That by repeating it, by breathing life into it again and again, communities ensure it never dies. "Maybe it doesn't matter if Lila survived," says folklorist Clevenger, "because in a way she did. She lives every time the story is told. She lives in the phrase daughter and wife. That's the true inheritance." The mountain remembers even now. Widow's Branch holds its silence. The ridge is quiet, but never empty. Wind drags through the trees like breath. Shadows shift in the corners of vision. And sometimes, when the night is still and the moon hangs low, a hymn drifts down the slope, as though the mountain itself is singing. Whether ghost, curse, or memory, the Harpers have become part of Appalachia's fabric. They are stitched into its folklore alongside the Bell Witch, the Mothman, and the Brown Mountain Lights. But unlike those stories, theirs carries a weight that feels too human to dismiss, too personal to shrug off. "She was both daughter and wife," says Edith Morgan, repeating the phrase like a prayer. "That's what folks say. But what I hear is this: she was trapped. Trapped by blood, by silence, by the mountains themselves. And when you trap something too long, it doesn't just die, it lingers. And so it lingers. In the hollows and ridges of West Virginia, in the whispers of porch-bound elders, in the daring footsteps of teenagers who climb the slope at night. The Harper story endures not because it is finished, but because it cannot finish. Every time someone steps onto Widow's Branch, every time someone hears a lullaby in the wind, the line between history and haunting blurs. Clara becomes both villain and victim. Lila becomes both daughter and wife. And Appalachia becomes what it has always been, a land where tragedy and folklore intertwine, refusing to let the past rest in peace. Thank you for watching. If you found this story haunting and want to hear more dark legends buried deep within America's forgotten places, be sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe so you never miss the secrets the mountains still keep.